The second part of this lecture is going to be talking about the petroleum geology and the history of the petroleum industry in California. And you may not realize it, but California has a really rich petroleum history. From the mid 1800s is when we first started producing oil from a hand-dug pit in the LA area. And in the mid 1860s, we had 65 oil companies operating in California. By early 1900s, there's over 24 million barrels of oil produced. 1980s is when we reached peak production for the state at 424 million barrels of oil per year. And to date, there's been over 29 billion barrels of oil and 40 trillion cubic feet of gas that have been produced in the state of California. And you may not think that this is prolific, but it really is, thinking about the technology or lack of technology in order to get these resources out of the ground in the late 1800s. It's quite extraordinary. And this picture below is from Signal Hill in 1934. It's just totally riddled with derricks, and I have a few other pictures to show you. And so this one is to show you where all the oil fields are within at least central California and south, where they all exist here. And then the next slide is from Midway Sunset Oil Field. But I want you to just pause and look at this, and this might surprise you to see how many oil fields there are. They're all outlined here in gray. And now here in our area, Ventura County, we have quite a few little oil fields all spattered throughout Ventura County, and they're actively producing right now. And some of them you may have seen, and maybe you haven't. One of the most prolific wells of the area was from Midway Sunset. That was the field I just showed you in the previous slide. In 1910, there was a blowout called the Lakeview Gusher #1 in San Joaquin Valley. And it flowed 18,000 barrels of oil per day and was uncontrollable when it reached peak production of 100,000 barrels of oil per day. And you can see here that this is actually a lake of oil that they're canoeing on. They're just rowing around in a lake full of oil. And this is just south of Bakersfield. If you've ever driven through Bakersfield, you've probably seen quite a few oil fields. There's a placard there today that you can see where it says this is the spot of the Lakeview Gusher. It's pretty interesting to go see, and if you've driven through there, then it's always interesting to look at all the wellheads and look at all the activity going on. Here's a map. It's a little bit blurred, but again, this is just to show you that even in LA area, look at how many oil fields there are. This one is outlined and labeled for each oil field. And there's all these little pockets of oil that have been produced. Some of them active, some of them not now. But there's so many oil fields. It's really crazy to think of how much history we have here in Los Angeles and within the state of California. And so here are some of those pictures from the late 1800s, early 1900s of those oil fields that were productive. And here's a picture of Long Beach oil field, all these derricks everywhere within the buildings near the coast of LA Basin. We can see now it's all been cleaned up and we have beautiful beaches, but it once was totally full of derricks and equipment. Here's a picture from Summerlin Beach up near Montecito. You can see that this is where we had the first structures offshore, sort of offshore. Here they're fairly shallow, but at least they had they went from just being onshore to taking them out into the water a little bit. It's all totally cleaned up now, except rumor has it, I personally haven't seen it, that at low tide here in Summerlin, if it's particularly low tide and maybe a warm day, you'd actually see some of the tops of the wellheads that have been abandoned. You can still see sometimes just like a metal wellhead, or sometimes you see some bubbling right at the surface, and that's because some of these wells were abandoned more properly than others. So it's pretty interesting. I haven't seen it myself, but that's an interesting place to go look. And right at the top of this beach here at the parking lot, there's a placard there that says some of the history of Summerlin Beach with the oil and gas industry. Here's a picture of Venice Beach. Looks a little bit different now, certainly with all the all the shops and all the, all sorts of stuff right near the beach. But this was once full of oil derricks. Another thing I wanted to mention about this history here, I didn't put a slide in, but some of this history is actually pretty well established in the movie There Will Be Blood. So if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. I have a slide at the end that shows you a little bit of where that first story originated. I just wanted to mention that. If you've seen that movie, then that's about the history of oil finding in California. It's very interesting. Okay, so hidden in plain view. These are some really interesting derricks and pumps and equipment in LA right now that you probably even would just drive by and think twice and not even realize that it was like full of equipment and they're actually producing or whatever it is. So one that you may see and just think that looks odd is Thumbs Island near Long Beach. And if you're just standing here near the harbor, it just looks like, a weird facade of fake palm trees. From the edge, you can see that these are all these fake trees on the outside. But these are man-made islands near Long Beach, and they home all these facilities, wellheads, equipment. You see there's vehicles here, and this produces from the Wilmington oil field. So there's I think there's five, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5 islands here that they're man-made structures that house equipment and stuff. And you can see them from Long Beach. It's not far off from where the boats are, but you may not have thought what it was, but that's an oil and gas facility right there. Here's the Packard well site. This building was built in 1967, and it just looks like a building. But then if you look more closely, you're like, yeah, there's no windows on this building. And it's along Pico in the Mid-Wilshire neighborhood, and it hides 52 oil and gas wells, which is owned by Sentinel Peak. And there's a derrick inside, and it's on tracks, and it moves across these wellheads within the structure. So from traffic is going along, business as normal, and maybe you've driven by this, or maybe it'll make you think twice about looking at buildings, and it looks like a building, but then you realize there's no windows in there. This is called the Tower of Hope. This is a 165-foot derrick at Beverly Hills High School, and was dubbed the Tower of Hope in 2000. They've painted on flowers to make it a little bit more artsy, but at first it was just, a tall gray tower. And there's lots of lawsuits associated with this because the owner, the company Venego, went bankrupt, and it's now shut down as of July 2017. But I believe this building is still here, and this houses a derrick right near high school. Now there's quite a few. Those are some fun hidden gems that you might see around LA, and then of course there's some that's just not hidden. You can just see it everywhere you go. One near Ventura County is Ventral Oil Field. This is right off of the highway, Highway 101. And perhaps you've driven up here and you've seen some flaring, or you've seen equipment off onto the side of the road. And then up here, back through Ventral Oil Field, there's a whole bunch of these synclines and anticlines, all this structure. And you see at the top of the hill, all these road cuts. These are like homes to wellheads. And so the whole hillside is totally riddled with pump jacks and pipelines and equipment. And of course, we have Oxnard Oil Field. If you've taken 5th Street or anywhere around here, you've probably driven through and seen some horse heads, or you've seen some storage tanks, or you've seen pipelines. So you can just drive right by them and see them right in our own backyard. Now here's a field that I used to work. It's in Kern River, which is just like northeast of Bakersfield area. And I love showing videos of Kern River, because if you haven't driven through there, seeing this video is quite overwhelming to see like how jam-packed these wells really are. And just goes to show that there's thousands and thousands and thousands, well, maybe not 3,000, but hundreds of thousands maybe of wells that have been produced that are producing actively, it's pretty crazy to see how jam-packed they are. So check this video out. So I've talked about some of the onshore history of California, but we also have quite a bit of offshore production history as well. So maybe you've seen some of these platforms from the beach, and they were first, like I just showed the picture from Summerlin. That's kind of where we had those piers that extended from the beach area. So the first technical offshore well was in 1897. And then in 1932, the first offshore platform was placed in 12 meters of water near Santa Barbara area. And the first offshore platform in federal waters, which is at least 3 miles away from the coastline, was in 1967. And that's platform Hogan, which is still in production today. And we have other platforms that are in production still. We have over 5 billion barrels of oil per year with cumulative production over 1.3 billion barrels from these platforms. So like I said, maybe you've seen them from the beach and from Ventura or Santa Barbara area. And if it's a clear day, you can see, the Channel Islands, and between them, you might see these little, what you might think are boats, but those are actually offshore platforms. Now, I've showed this map before of all the oil and gas fields within the state. And the little stars represent all the ones that I've personally worked on. And they're all slightly different. So it's really interesting. It's an interesting profession to be in, because you think that it's a petroleum system. It's simple. You just have your source and reservoir rock and all these things. But there's so many small intricacies with every well, every field, every detail, that it's quite rewarding, but also challenging field to be in sometimes. So I currently work in the offshore environment, and the field that I work is Point Pedernales and Point Arbella Field over here, just off the coast of up near Santa Barbara and Lompoc. The other field I showed you the video about, Kern River, that's over here on the northeast side of Bakersfield. And down here, that's the Midway Sunset with that large gusher oil from gusher oil well. And some of these other fields I've worked as well. This is McKittrick and Simrick, and up here, Lost Hills is over here. So if you've driven through this part of the state, then you would just see left and right all sorts of oil fields and all sorts of pump heads and things like that. So when we talk about all the small details of what makes one oil field different than the other, how they became in this location, why are they in this orientation? Well, maybe if you just look generally at this map, you would be able to just see some trends that, there's a long trend here of near Highway 33 that most of these fields are oriented in the same direction. They're kind of in the same area. And so then that starts to, turn the wheel of how these fields were formed. Were they formed at the same time as each other? And that's when we talk about why depositional environments are so important. So if you remember back to our previous lecture about depositional environments, we need to understand how those rocks were formed, what the earth was like during that time, to try to step backwards, use our investigation skills to understand what's going on. And so not only how they're formed, but we're also really looking into those rock properties, because as we talked about in the last lecture, you need a reservoir rock, you need a source rock, but with that, you need to be able to move the oil and gas if it's there within the rock. And that has to do with that porosity and permeability. Those are some of the things that we discussed in context of groundwater, but that also has to do with other fluids like oil that's in a rock. So all of these things are important in understanding if a rock is sufficient to be a reservoir rock. And so I walked through this early on, so maybe it was confusing then, but maybe it makes more sense now after we've discussed more and more of different geological aspects of how all those pieces come together here in a petroleum system. So this is stepping back in geologic time. This is the coast of California. Here we are roughly where that star is. These are the Channel Islands, and this is in the Quaternary period. So this is most, pretty recent geologic time. And if we keep stepping back in time, here we see in the Miocene, Pliocene, the start of those transverse ranges. We're still somewhat coastal, but if we keep going back and back further in the early Miocene and mostly in the middle Miocene, here we can see that we're actually in a shallow marine, or a lot of that coast is where we're standing right now was totally underwater. And you can see that some of these systems here right along the coast look lagoon-like, and so that's where we get some of those interesting depositional systems that we see here on the coast with the Monterey Formation and things like that. And so, of course, trying to understand, what rocks we see formed in the Oligocene. This is deeper marine or coastal shelf, depending on where you are. And these are recreations based on what we sort of understand from the rock record. But all of these things are important to understanding what type of environment they're formed in, and then to help us understand what type of rocks there are they, what their properties would be, what sort of sedimentary structures they have. So here's an example of a stratigraphic column from the area, and the stratigraphic column represents the different layers that are observed within the subsurface, and it typically contains important information like the rock age, a rock description, sometimes how thick it is, if there's unconformities, if it contains oil and gas, if there's fossils, simple observations and things like that. So a stratigraphic column is a generalized column of an area that represents a larger area. And so if we look at a stratigraphic column near the coastline, we're really looking at those layers that are present that are oil bearing. And one of the most common oil bearing zones in this area and in the Central Valley is the Monterey Formation, which is the most prolific reservoir. It's an organic-rich complex series of silicious to porcelaneous shale, siltstone, and chert, and it can contain limestone and dolomite. It's deposited in shallow to deep marine events followed by deposition, burial, and diagenesis. So the images I just showed you support that during the middle Miocene, we are in a shallow to deep marine environment, and we see that reflected here with some of the outcrops of the Monterey Formation. And so that's a quick reason why we talk about depositional environments, how important it is, all these other rock properties. And so, like I said, I've had some experiences within the petroleum industry, and that previous map I showed you with all the stars of some of the oil fields I worked at. Here's some pictures of my experiences. I was working on a hydraulic fracturing job in the Lakeview oil field. That's this picture on the right. And that was from the Monterey Formation. I explained diagenesis in a previous lecture, which is a little bit complicated, but that had a lot to do with the target of this particular well, which was at about 7,000 feet depth. Now here, this picture on the left, this is from Lakeview oil field. This is where some of that oil has seeped to the surface. If you look at my Carpinteria field video, you can see some seeps right near us in Carp, and it's kind of fun to go and check this out, poke it with a stick. But the reason I brought up There Will Be Blood earlier is because There Will Be Blood is based on California history, and part of that story is told from Central Valley, California, where you have these seeps like from the Lakeview oil field. And I highly recommend that movie. It's a little bit mature, but it does a really good job of telling a story from that perspective of what it was like to be an oil baron in the early 1900s. Here's a picture of me flying in a helicopter to platform. This picture is actually platform Irene up near Santa Barbara. And then I've been able to go to platform B. Here's some of the drilling equipment. You can see that these are the all the pipes that they hook into each other in order to push pipe further into the ground. And so when we talk about, well, what's, that's where we're at. We've produced all of these, all of this oil from all of these wells and all of these fields within California. So what is the future? What's the future of oil and gas in California? And I think things are changing right now with the price of oil plummeting due to COVID and other global events, and a push to change to more environmental friendly, renewable energy type things. So Governor Newsom in 2019 banned hydraulic fracturing in the state of California. That was sort of overturned. There was a study done by Lawrence Livermore that said, well, fracking is okay, and they issued permits to North and South Bell Ridge fields. So there's a push and pull here between the public view as well as science of what should be allowed and what's safe to do. So currently, they are issuing fracking permits in the state of California, but it's certainly not. It's something that is still being discussed and challenged within legislature. So if we talk about where we're headed, California once was one of the #1 producers, and this chart is a bit dated. This is from 2015, so I'm sure these numbers are slightly different. And so early in the 1900s, California was the #1 producer. And of course, as technology changes, as we learn more about unconventional resources, some of these other states have surpassed California. Texas is by far the leader in production. However, California we're still doing all right here with our production, competing with other states. If you're thinking about how much of our oil comes from our state alone. If we look at the counties that produce the most oil, Kern County is the largest. This is near Bakersfield. And then we have a slice here of LA County or LA area. And then here we are in purple Ventura County and Santa Barbara. So we make up a small portion of the production of the state. But generally speaking, California does quite a bit of oil and gas production. And when we think about where those sources are coming from in our use of crude oil, we can see that our production has fallen significantly since this plot shows from 1985 to 2015. We're definitely on the decrease of how much production is coming from California. And of course, this impacts our reliance on our energy demand. Just because we're producing less doesn't mean that our energy demand is less. So we need to get more oil from other places if we're not producing it here. And so we've been getting some oil from Alaska, but majority of that has now been provided to us from other foreign supplies. It's being boated in from Asia or from the Middle East. And so that can be an issue when we talk about our dependence on other countries for our resources. So you can see this is also dated 2017. So this chart has not been updated to some of the world events that have been happening within the last year or so. But we can just see that in 2017, our energy dependence was on Saudi Arabia, 29% imports. Ecuador, I said Asia. I think that's something that's maybe more recent because of some of the world events that have happened. I don't know if we're as dependent on Saudi Arabia now as we were. Hopefully, certainly not Iraq and a few of these other countries. So does it matter where we get our oil? Well, if we think about what our relationships are with some of these countries. That could be, that if we think about it in a global scale, where do we get our oil could be really important politically, as well as price cost and things like that. What is the consumer price of oil? And when we think about how I think the most tangible thing is pumping your gas. You say, oh man, it's $4 a gallon here in California. That's really expensive. And how does that reflect the price of oil? Like when I say that fields produce, 1 million barrels of oil, that's also conceptually difficult to understand. So if you think about a barrel, what a barrel looks like, it's about, I don't know, 4 feet high, pretty wide around. That's 1 barrel of oil. So we produce a lot of oil, but how does that translate to our pump? So I did find this updated chart, how oil prices have changed in the last 20 years or so. And we can see that we are here at the boom and bust of 2008, the financial crisis here. And then we were doing pretty all right. And then oil prices, of course, are cyclical, but right now we're in a pretty bad time for oil prices due to the coronavirus and other global political issues that have been happening. And I drew a line at around between $60 and $70. This line is roughly where companies in the United States say this is productive, this is economic. So anytime prices are above $70, then oil companies are raking in the dough. Now, if it's low like this, or if you're on the cusp like we were right before the virus hit, well, that makes it challenging for companies to make that economic decision of whether or not it's worth it to continue to produce oil and gas, because the prices do not do not favor them. And so I had this this plot earlier as well. This is our primary energy consumption. So when we look at where we are with our energy consumption and where we're headed, we're certainly adding more renewable energy to our portfolios with solar, wind, and things like that. But we're still very much dependent on oil and coal. And you think, that you can reduce your dependency on oil products, but it's actually really difficult to do, because if you look at this simple chart here, you say that we are a consumer. I am a consumer of oil products. And it's so easy to think that, oh, I haven't been driving this summer, so I'm not really using oil, or, I haven't been on a plane, so I'm not using fuel. But really, all the products that we buy have petroleum in them. And so we have to think about some of those choices as a consumer. If we're trying to step away from our dependence on oil products, then you have to think about what that means for the things that you purchase and the stuff around you. Our phones, just sitting right here at my desk, I have a phone that's full of, my phone case is full of petroleum products. Here's a mouse, the pen here that has a little rubber guy. These are all petroleum products, and they're all right here, just sitting in front of me. So now when we think about this as a consumer, again, try to understand where your choices lie, and trying to make the right choices, but also realize that we will be dependent on oil, and we will be dependent on oil for quite some time, because it's really hard to wean ourselves from some of these products and how cheaply we like them. Okay, so the future of oil and gas, generally speaking, is that there are regulations in place to make sure that everything is done safely and properly. We have agencies like the state and the agency that I work for the federal government, that make sure that companies are held to a standard of production and safety, of course. And as a consumer, even myself included, we need to be aware of our habits and lifestyle. We can't just get rid of oil. Of course, we want to do better for the environment and think about the global impacts. But really, what we can do as a consumer is do better at choosing our products, as well as how much we consume of that, and how we can support energy independence. So that's it for this one. See you next time.